Clapperboard, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, He Saved the Lost Hatchlings of the Most Feared Alien Dragon, but didn't expect what happened next. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. The storm had a voice and it knew his name. It called in long, low growls that rolled across the basin, rattling the bones of the desert and the thoughts in his skull. Lightning stitched the belly of the clouds. Dust moved in veils across the cracked flats. He kept walking. He had nothing else to do but keep walking. Captain Elias Ward, Recon Division, Terran Expeditionary Force, had lived through the crash and most of a week afterward. He wasn't sure how. The drop cradle had blown wide like a peeled tin can, cockpit torn away. Most of his team had burned up on entry. The rest died when the ground hit back. He counted his steps to stay awake. Every 100 he lifted his visor to taste the air and listen for wings. On Vialia Roman 9, wings meant endings. A rib of stone rose from the sand like a ship's keel. He limped along its length, following the shadow it made across the flats, until the rock sloped down into a cleft half hidden by thorn brush and dead grass. He squeezed through. The wind dropped away as if cut by a blade. The silence felt like a trap and also like mercy. He blinked grit from his eyes and froze. The canyon floor was strewn with shells the color of oil-slick rainbows. Some were shattered. Some were half-buried, their inner membranes snapped like silk. The smell was metallic and sweet, mixed with a cooked tang that made his tongue ache. Scorched furrows scarred the walls. Bones lay in drifts, some small and delicate, others long and knotted, fused by heat. And there, trembling and alive, were 4 hatchlings. Elias forgot the storm, forgot the pain in his ribs and the thirst that drilled behind his eyes. The hatchlings were the size of large dogs, wings like folded flags, scales still soft and translucent. Their eyes were big and clouded as if they'd been born under deep water and hadn't quite learned what light meant. They hissed at him, not a threat, more a plea. He crouched and slowly unclipped his canteen. "Easy," he said, useless word to creatures who didn't know human sounds. He poured a mouthful of water into his palm. The nearest sniffed, then surged forward to lap. It was hot, almost feverishly hot, the tiny tongue rough as pumice. "You're hungry," he murmured. "You're everything, I know." He didn't know how long he sat with them, long enough for the storm to pass and a sallow twilight to settle in the canyon. He fed them the last protein paste he had, breaking the ration into quarters and fighting the trembling in his own hands. When they slept, he scavenged. He found a cavity under a rock shelf and built a lean-to from shattered hull plating. He dragged in blankets, a medkit, a coil of cable he might use as a snare. He found a cracked power cell that still held a charge, and the tiny stove it fed. He set it to warm the space and sat with his back to the wall, listening to the hatchlings breathe. He named them because names made it harder to fail. The smallest, the one who had lapped from his hand, Pip. The bold, smoky one who kept trying to climb him despite his armor, Ember. The pale, watchful one, Halo. The largest, who lay between the others with a stern patience that felt older than stone flint. He went to sleep listening to the wind run its harp across the canyon mouth, and woke to the soft knock of little horns against his chest. Ember tried to steal his glove. Pip tried to burrow in his vest. Halo stared at him thoughtfully and then at the sky, as if cloudy wisdom were watching from above. Flint didn't move until Elias moved, and then Flint followed. 3 days later he taught them to drink from the trickle he'd coaxed out of a cracked pipe on the canyon wall. 5 days later he found a burrow of glass-limbed lizards beneath the sand and started trapping them on a schedule. 7 days later he taught the hatchlings to share. He taught himself to stop dreaming about rescue. By the 2nd week they were shoulder-high and full of contradictions, greedy and generous, explosive and shy. They were obsessed with light. They chased reflections and flares, pounced on glints of mica, stared at the stove flame as if it were telling secrets in a language only fire-hearted creatures understood. When they slept, faint light pulsed from their throats, bioluminescent breathing like the glow of distant cities. He sang to them at night. It quieted them and him. Old Earth songs he barely remembered, songs his mother had hummed while soldering microcoils, his father had whistled while building the kind of chairs that made you want to stay in one place. The hatchlings made small answering sounds, thin crystalline tones that braided into harmony like river water. It hurt, the way beauty does when it arrives where you expect only loss. He tried not to think about their mother. He failed. He thought of the briefings, the blurred satellite footage, the long lists of names. Drakar, heat-resistant megafauna possessing nuclear flame sacs and conductive wing membranes, plasma expulsion capability measured at weapon-grade magnitude. Apex predator. Colonial threat classification, extinction level. Engagement rule set, no quarter. He thought of the recordings he'd watched in orbit. Cities turned to glazing while the fleet argued about what bright lines meant and what retaliatory ethics could survive when survivors did not. He thought of the shadows that looked like people holding hands, frozen in glass. He looked at the little creatures sleeping with noses tucked under wings and thought about what it meant to meet anything at birth. The ground shook on the 12th night. It started as a tremor that crept up through rock and tendon, a subsonic murmur that became a heartbeat so large the world had to widen to hold it. The hatchlings woke in a scatter of bright peeps. Elias stood, every nerve a wire. The tremor rose, gathered, broke. A shape fell out of the storm, vast as a mountain shrugging off gravity, wings scalloped with lightning, scales like moving glaciers under moonlight. She folded onto the desert with a sound like cities becoming sand. When she raised her head, the sky moved. Elias didn't reach for his rifle. He could imagine it firing, a little spark in a world of thunder. He could imagine how quickly it would become an artifact, then ash. The hatchlings did not hesitate. They chirped and bolted, awkward and brilliant, toward the giant shadow of their mother. She lowered her head and crooned, voice the size of weather. She sniffed each of them, touched their faces with a tongue like a ribbon of molten gold. Her wings trembled. Then her gaze found the human crouched at the canyon mouth. It held him the way a singularity holds light, as if there were no world beyond that look. He saw intelligence there, layered and old. He saw hunger and grief. And then unexpectedly, unreasonably, he saw recognition. She inhaled. Heat braided the air. The stones around him sang with it. Elias stood slowly, hands empty, heartbeat trying to leap out of his chest. They were alone, he said, and heard his voice break like a small wave on a big shore. I didn't know what else to do. She exhaled. The blast lifted his hair and flattened the thorn brush. It should have burned him, but it didn't. It smelled like hot rain, new iron, the air 3 seconds after a lightning strike. She lowered her head until her eye, round and deep, veined with faint light, filled his entire world. In that depth he felt something that was not words and not thought. It was the way a mountain accepts a river. Not consent, not surrender, but an allowance to pass. The giant dragon drew back, gathered her hatchlings with a fan of her wing and launched into the storm. She circled once and vanished into cloud. The canyon rang with the sudden smallness of everything left. The hatchlings returned one by one, Pip first, tripping over her own tail and chirping triumph, Ember next, scrappy and scowling about being picked up mid-sprint, Halo gliding down one ledge at a time with the solemnity of a priest, and Flint last, walking backward to keep watching the sky. They pressed against Elias and hummed sleepily as the storm moved away. He sat down in the shadows and realized he was laughing and crying, and something in him had just been changed forever. He knew she could have killed him and didn't. He knew she had seen him and decided he was not prey. That decision did not feel like mercy. It felt like a treaty signed on a battlefield where language did not exist yet. They learned to fly the next month because the wind insisted. It shoved them off ledges in gentle gusts. It caught their wings and taught their bones to remember. Elias ran below them like a coach at the edge of a pool while they crashed into thorn, sand, each other, the low roof of their shelter. Pip laughed a sound like tinkling glass. Ember tried to breathe fire at the wind and almost lit her own feet. Halo watched and learned and then leapt and glided halfway across the canyon, startling herself into a triumphant yodel that echoed for minutes. Flint flew last and traveled furthest, a deep thrum of power in his chest, and an expression that was not pride and not humility but some ancient mixture of both. Elias learned new chores, polishing wings with oiled cloth to reduce tearing, climbing rock faces to retrieve stuck hatchlings and injured pride, cooking lizard meat with spices scavenged from the drop cradle's emergency pantry until even Ember would stop trying to eat the food cold. He built windbreaks. He learned to sleep with one ear open for the sound of a scale snagging on rock. He started carving little pieces of shell into pendants and threading them on the inside of his collar because the smell of them, mineral and faintly sweet, had become home. He also built a transmitter. He told himself it was because he had a duty, and he did, but he also told himself he would not press the send key. He did not correct himself when he left the panel unlatched, dusty, and easily discovered. He told himself lies because he suspected the truth would be too heavy to carry, and he would have to live under it like an anvil and forget how it felt to lift his eyes. Then the Terran fleet arrived and burned the lies out of him. He saw them first as a silver undercurrent in the sky, as if the clouds had developed bones. Then came the low whump of air torn into new shapes and plasma stabs falling like spite. The canyon lit blue-white. The hatchling screamed. Elias ran. The dropship that found his beacon wore his old unit's crest on its paint, as if it were a friend at a door he hadn't knocked on. The ramp hissed open. 8 soldiers fanned out in brittle discipline, rifles tracking heat like curious wolves. Their commander was smaller than he remembered, or maybe he was bigger now in ways that didn't show. Lieutenant Commander Mara Aelian, who had laughed at his stupid card tricks and taught him to shoot without looking down the sights. "Ward," she said, as if saying it quiet would keep it real. Her shoulders lowered half an inch. "Gods, we thought, I know." He spread his hands, palms up, nothing to hide and nowhere to put it. "Mara, listen." Then the hatchling stepped into sight. Harmony shattered, rifles rose, hums became hard lines, the air in his mouth turned copper. Mara's eyes flashed with reflex and then with a deep, burning anger that was not fear exactly. It was a ledger of dead faces, a catalog of broken places. "Step away," she said softly. "Ward, don't make me," he shook his head. "They're not what we think." "They're exactly what we think," someone said from the line, young, voice muffled by helmet. "Sir, with respect, those things, children," Elias said. The word felt fragile, ridiculous. "And they saved my life a dozen times. Stand down." Ember huffed smoke. Flint stood at Elias's shoulder like a stone come to life. Pip hid behind his leg. Halo watched the rifles as if cataloging them and the angles between. "Ward," Mara said again, grief in her voice now, "please." He felt the moment fracture. He saw the branches like a top-down schematic of a street he'd never walk again. In the branch where he stepped aside, the hatchlings died in a flare of orders obeyed, and he would die after, empty as a room with all the furniture removed. In the branch where he did not, he would become enemy to the people who had once felt like the whole shape of home. He did not step aside. He moved one pace forward and set the length of his body between all muzzles and the small lives behind him. He set his calm where fear should be and found that it would hold. "Mara," he said almost gently, "we break the galaxy if we keep doing this. You know we do." She closed her eyes for a count of 1. When she opened them, they were officer eyes. "On my mark," she said. The mark never landed. Ember shrieked and spat a line of blue fire that curled over Elias's shoulder like a ribbon and hit the sand 2 meters in front of the line. The glass it made sang. Pip startled and sprang and tangled with a private's legs. The private fired reflexively. The bolt leapt wide and stung a wing. Flint roared the sky down. Chaos reached in and turned the moment inside out. Elias grabbed Pip and rolled. Sand became glass under his cheek. He smelled roasted electrolyte and the bitter lemon tang of suit coolant, heard screaming he recognized. Realized it was his own voice raw from trying to unmake what had already started. He fired once to the side, pure warning, a slice of light that said stop louder than his throat could. Someone obeyed, someone else did not. When it was finished, half the squad lay still. Flames licked the edge of the dropship ramp. Halo stood on shattered glass with her wings spread like a shield, her eyes bright and terrible. Mara lowered her rifle with shaking hands and looked at him as if a planet had just been peeled away to show what moved underneath. "Gods," she whispered, not a prayer. "Ward, what have you done?" He stood with Pip tucked under his arm and sand in his mouth. He tasted metal and grief. "What we did," he said hoarsely, "is forget how to notice." The fleet did not forget. They returned with a memory like a wound. For 3 days the sky seethed. Strike ships hunted between storms, seeking any wing signature that was long and fast. The hatchlings hid in deep rock and seismic cracks, where Elias had mapped heat currents and carved resting shelves with a makeshift plasma cutter. He moved quietly in the cracks and talked to them in low, steady rhythms he didn't feel anywhere else in his body. At night, Halo let him curl against her chest and sleep with his face in the hollow where her neck met her shoulder. When he woke, he could still hear the heartbeat that had held him in his dreams, and it smelled like hot rain. On the 4th morning, the world rearranged itself again. The Drakar mother came back, not alone. They arrived like a climate, 6 giants and a dozen middle-sized shapes, wings beating thunder into the air. Their eyes glowed with contained storms. They landed around the canyon and made a circle of mountains that could move. The mother stood at the north point and lowered her head to Elias. You would call it mind speech if you had to put human language near it, but that would make it smaller than it was. It was not words and not images. It was a form of understanding that felt like stone warmed by sun, a shape that, when placed in his consciousness, made everything around it realign into sense. You kept what was mine, the understanding said. You burn differently. He considered the half-unit of soldiers under glass cairns and the way Mara had looked at him through smoke. I burn too. All breathing things burn. The question is, how do they tend the fire? He touched his chest with the hand that had once held a send key and did not. I don't know how to make this stop. We do not stop storms, the shape of the thought said. We learn the hills that teach them to turn. The Drakar surrounded him and his 4 like a living topography. From above, perhaps it looked like a ring of mountains protecting a strange new valley. The fleet saw a target. The first strike fell at the edge of the ring. The sand flashed to mirror. The air buckled. Elias flinched. The dragons didn't. They lifted their heads and let the blasts wash over scales that brightened and sang. He realized with a hard jolt that the giants had landed exactly where they wanted the fire to fall. Wings opened. The giants leapt as one. Their ascent shook dust from the canyon roofs. Lightning stitched the sky again, but this time it looked like celebration. Plasma met plasma. The fleet had never planned for prey that hunted heat and drank light straight from the metal mouths of ships. The sky tilt lasted a long hour. It was everywhere at once and also a single repeating beat. Lift, strike, fall, turn. Elias watched from stone and knew 2 things as surely as he knew his own name. That his life had just been given a direction, and that it would grind him down to a bright edge over time if he let it. He did. The edge was worth it. He learned to ride the back of the one he called the mother because he had no other word. He learned the places where her scales made steps for his hands, and the rhythm of her takeoff that would either snap his spine or save him if he guessed wrong. He learned to fall without panic and how to land on running feet when she dropped him into a gale, laughing a heat thunder that might have been encouragement. He taught the hatchlings to spiral in formation, the four of them like a moving compass with him at the center, flicking hand signals he'd borrowed from infantry and birds. They learned fast because flying was a language older than all the rest, and because hatchlings listened to him the way water listens to gravity. He taught both species a thing neither had considered: how to interlace. Human squads learned to move under the shadow of wings. Dragons learned to stoop in sync with the stutter of ground fire volleys. The first time a battalion charged through the wind of a crescendoing wing beat into a breach boiled open by blue flame, the enemy, the actual enemy, the one from the rim that ate power and planet crust indiscriminately and wore stars like stolen jewelry, broke for the first time in a decade. He buried enemies after and allies beside. He learned funerals made of glass are too heavy to move and too sharp not to. He learned to talk low with warriors who had lost blood and family and breath. He learned the ways dragons mourn. They do not keen. They dim. The light under their scales fades for days. They stand on high ridges where wind speaks and do not move. Sometimes they let the young lean against them the way rocks let moss grow. Often they do not. Word traveled in rumors and then in songs sung too fast in barracks late at night. If you listened to the way the vowels lengthened when men and women spoke of it, you could hear the way hope fits badly in a mouth unused to it and then starts to belong. They called Elias the bridge. He hated it and accepted it. Bridges weren't meant to be loved. They were meant to be crossed. He fought a campaign of cairns. After every battle he had breath for, he set one stone on another in stacks that looked both fragile and inevitable. He learned the word the Drakar used for such stacks, something like remember shape, and added it to the few he could make with his throat. A Drakar who had lost a brother to heat once pressed a fossil in his palm and touched his forehead in the same motion, which might have been prayer, might have been gratitude, might have been simply an acknowledgement that existence suffers and carries on. He kept the fossil in a pouch with the shells. A year after the canyon, Lieutenant Commander Mara Ailian found him again. No rifles this time, just her and the hot wind and a look like stains that couldn't be washed out. "Can you forgive me?" she asked without preface, the muscles around her mouth a map of fights. Elias looked at the strip of desert between her boots and his. The sun made it shimmer as if the world had just been born and all particles were negotiating their jobs. He thought of how forgiveness had become less like a word and more like a long, long job for the hands. "I can work at it," he said honestly. "That's the most true I can be." She nodded as if truth were what she'd come for and not absolution. "I brought something." It was a memory stick with a thin crack in the casing. He recognized the hand that had labeled it his from before. It held footage from scouting drones that had watched the Drakar before the first human engines ever wheeled flame over their nesting grounds. The footage showed giants teaching their young to balance eggs on their backs. It showed old dragons lying in semicircles around a nursery and generating a heat field calibrated to within a degree. It showed a yearly ceremony where the dragons carried their dead into the sky and drew spirals that widened until the pattern was bigger than towns. It showed a civilization that had never needed buildings because their bodies were their architecture, a civilization that could hold its history in flight. The stick should have been in every briefing. It hadn't been. He looked at Mara and knew she had discovered the omission and decided never again. "I'm in command of ground liaison now," she said, sounding as if she was still convincing the bone in her voice to accept the new marrow. "We either do this right, or we don't deserve to do it at all." They did it right enough times that the ledger of failures began to look, if you squinted, like a plan. Human pilots learned the helical dive that dragons had developed to shear air shear without cooking their own bellies. Dragons learned to pulse long-wave radar off their scales and signal threat directions with wing tilts. Together they developed a trick that felt like cheating the laws of anything. A tandem climb in which a dragon carried a human-powered lift cart in her slipstream, then flipped, releasing the cart in a parabolic arc into the exact slot in the enemy formation, where everything broke if exactly that amount of weight fell at exactly that speed. It worked a ridiculous number of times before the rim eaters adapted, which they always did, because that's what a horizon does when you keep walking toward it. Loss returned. It never left. Some days the sand stained darker and the wind smelled like a hospital remembering rain. Some nights Elias lay on his back under a wing ceiling and counted the scars he couldn't touch, the ones on his flesh and the ones on whatever part of a person used to be naive. He decided scars had a job. They kept you from tearing in the same place next time. They didn't prevent pain. They reshaped it. He told the hatchling stories. They told him flying. Pip asked for stories of small things, how bread worked, what a river was under ice, why people built benches in parks at a curve that made strangers sit closer, not farther. Ember wanted war tales and then grew quiet when he told the ends, which were always about people dropping weapons to pick up something heavy and carry it anyway. Halo asked questions that weren't really about answers. Why do some skies look like promises and keep them and some look like promises and don't? What happens to a name when the person stops needing it? Flint asked nothing and watched everything, and sometimes he leaned his head against Elias's shoulder so gently Elias didn't realize there was pressure until he missed it. They grew into forces. Not bigger. There is a limit to size if you want to stay Air's friend, but denser, more themselves. You could feel them coming down a corridor by how the dust changed its mind. The Drakar mother visited when the sky burned too bright or when the young ones dimmed after a fight. She always stood on the north side of whatever space she chose, as if her body held a compass. Elias came to her one dusk and stood at the north without thinking. She lowered her head and the top of it brushed his shoulder like a handshake. "You understand turning," the shape said. "Not all who fight do. I understand that forward isn't always the answer. The biggest mistake groundlings make is not looking for the currents they can ride." He thought of leadership as he had once understood it, rigid posture, hard choices, and of leadership as he'd been forced to practice it, listening like a hunt, knowing when to offer his body as a thing to tie decisions to so others would not drift. "Teach me the ones you see." She did. He learned the language of wind shoulders and heat wells. He learned to read the world as a set of invitations. If you listened long enough, the world told you how to move without breaking it more than you had to. The enemy at the rim did not listen. It carved. It chewed. It took orbital bites of worlds and spat out slag that clanged together like wrong bells. The Allied fleet formed a ring across 3 systems, a thin necklace that kept snapping where stress moved. Elias and his 4 kept traveling to the breakpoints, patching with speed and presence, and a kind of hard, quiet care that had begun to feel like the whole point of being alive. The battle that should have killed them happened at Adhara Gate, where a wormhole burped radiation like spite, and the rim eaters rode it out in waves. The human and Drakar wing was outnumbered 5-1. The smart play was retreat. The right play looked like loss you chose on your own terms. Mara stood on the command deck of a carrier with her jaw working like she was grinding sand into glass. "We hold for evacuation," she said. "Ward, can you buy me 15 minutes of believing in a future?" He looked at his companions in the launch bay. Pip's eyes were bright like rain on metal. Ember was rolling her shoulders the way she did when she wanted the fight to be honest. Halo's wingtips traced lines in the air as if she were solving the math of what would be required. Flint simply watched until Elias met his gaze and then dipped his chin once, the Drakar sign for "I am beside you whether we live or not." "We'll buy you all that and change," Elias said, and felt how words could be currency that didn't lose value when spent. They went out like knives thrown by a steady hand. The rim eaters didn't swarm so much as ooze intelligence, like metal remembering it could be liquid again. Elias rode Ember high and fast, bait and needle both. Pip dove low, drawing fire away from rescue craft with her impossible speed and little joyful taunts that made Elias both laugh and want to shout "be careful" into her skull. Halo and Flint flew together, a double helix of patience and punch, cutting lanes for freighters and bodies. They burned. Everyone burned. They did it the way the mother had meant, tended, aimed, at a heavy cost, and for a reason shaped like more than revenge. Elias lost count of the number of times he felt something punch his suit, and the number of times a wing came between him and the rest of that punch. He lost track of which turn saved a life, and which turn simply made the loss happen somewhere his eyes weren't at that second. At minute 14 of the 15 they'd promised, a freighter carrying 2,000 evacuees got caught on the lip of the gate. Gravity hooks latched like teeth on a soft throat. Elias saw the arc of it in a slice of time that didn't seem long enough to hold what was needed. Flint saw it too. He screamed, a sound like a rock slide ordering boulders to move, and went vertical so fast that air fractured. He hit the freighter's side and shoved. No one had seen a dragon do that. The freighter moved. The hooks flexed, trying to keep their prey. Flint pushed harder. His chest plates glowed so bright Elias thought they would crack and something inside him would pour out he would not know how to catch. "Flint," Elias said aloud and in the place where you speak when your mouth can't. "Brother, don't." Flint didn't listen. He leaned his whole existence into that one shove and made the difference between doom and done. The freighter slid free and limped toward the carrier. Flint hung for an impossibly long moment between push and fall. He fell. Halo shrieked and dove after him. Pip and Ember banked so hard they left contrails you could hear. Elias jumped without thinking. The drop took the breath from his blood. For a heartbeat he could see nothing but the shape of Flint's body folding around a wound he could not outfly. Halo reached him first. She tilted in the last second and took Flint's weight onto her back. The impact rang through her bones into Elias's. Pip slotted under her wing and threw her body into a stabilizing tilt. Ember flew ahead and scoured the air of debris with angry fire that said not one more thing today. They landed in the carrier bay like a storm deciding to be gentle with a town it liked. Medics ran with tools that whined and smoked against Drakar hide. They cut into Flint's chest with plasma scalpels and inserted things that glowed. They shouted numbers. They pushed Elias away twice, and he returned twice, until a medic with kind eyes touched his hand on purpose and said, "Please." The word hurt more than a shove. Flint's light sputtered. Dragons don't bleed the way humans do. Their blood is slower, more molten, and when it meets air it hardens like a promise. The promise was not to die today. It took hours for that promise to stick. Flint lived. He would carry a starburst of scar lines across his chest that sometimes sang when the weather changed. He needed to relearn angles and tolerance and how to breathe without pain. He did it with the steady patience he brought to everything. Elias found himself beside that bed more nights than he slept. In the weeks after at Hara Gate, the war bent. It did not end. Wars never end the way a story does, on a line that feels like a clean cut. But something about the shape of it became rounder around the edge where people were. The enemy couldn't hold the thefts it made. The dragons began to draw their morning spirals higher and less often. Children on ships played at flying by leaning against bulkheads whenever a carrier banked and whispering, "I am light." Elias aged. He had not expected to. Legacies are a kind of aging. The slow distance between the first decision you make against your training and the last time someone who never knew you says your name like it is a place, and they might go there when they need shelter. He woke one morning with more gray in his hair and less ache in his grief. He took Pip to a quiet moon that had once harvested ice, and now grew greenhouse strawberries in long rows under thin suns. She sat very carefully on her haunches and ate strawberries off their stems with a concentration that made farmers lean on their hoes and smile like kids. Ember developed a taste for loud music and took to flying over concerts, beating her wings exactly on the downbeat for the joy of feeling 1,000 humans shout yes at the same time. Halo read books. No one had planned for dragons that read, so the library boards retrofitted booths with heat-resistant seats and shelves that slid toward claws at a nudge. Halo became an expert in architectural history and wind gardens. She designed a school where the classrooms had windows facing prevailing winds, so that on exam days the breeze sounded like applause. Flint returned to flying, slower and deeper. He taught a generation of hatchlings how to carry weight without breaking, using little carts with stones that he added one by one as they learned the geometry of lift. He stood on high places some evenings and stared toward Virelia Roman 9 and did not speak. Elias stood beside him sometimes and didn't either. The Drakar mother grew old. It surprised him to realize it. He had thought of her as the kind of constant the universe doesn't dare argue with. Her steps got a little shorter. The bright lines under her scales dimmed to a steadier tone. She still launched into storms, just didn't go as far into them. One afternoon on the ridge above the old canyon, she touched her forehead to Elias's and stayed there a long breath. The whole planet held still, even the wind bowed. "You understand tending," she said. "You are almost done." "I don't know what I'm supposed to be when I'm done," he admitted, feeling the frankness of age loosen something that youth had kept tight, something softer that can hold everything you were. He laughed, surprised at the sound and how it came without bitterness. "That sounds like work." "It is." She leaned back and looked toward the storm line. "All real things are." When she died, it was not in battle but in the sky she loved. She gathered the young and rose, and her body drew 4 spirals before her light folded inward, and she was a silhouette in blue. The spirals widened as if her last breath had become their wind. Dragons do not fall when they die, they decide not to stay. She decided in beauty. They built her cairn not of stone but of wind song. For 3 days, dragons flew patterns over the canyon mouth, while humans stood below holding lengths of polished metal that caught sound and resonated it into the earth, until the ground itself hummed grief that felt like praise. Elias spoke that day and his voice shook, and that was acceptable. He told the story of a canyon where a hungry man met 4 hungry lives and decided to feed them. He told the story of what happened because of stubborn kindness. The war receded geographically. Armistices are compromises. This one was also a woven mat, human Drakar, the smaller species who had watched for years and decided now that stepping onto the mat wouldn't mean slipping through. The rim eaters pulled back to the edge where they could continue to be themselves without anyone trying to teach them how not to. It wasn't victory. It was a boundary that said here be people and expected to be believed. Elias retired where it began. The canyon had changed in small ways. A ring of polished metal wind chimes on the east wall where a school had taught itself how to honor. A garden of thornless succulents Halo had engineered to survive on morning mist. A little landing pad where couriers left letters and picked up ones he wrote, because he was still learning to say "I am here" in writing instead of war. He lived in a round house built of fused sand and patience. One room contained cairn stones he couldn't place yet. Another held maps drawn by children whose hands had never aimed weapons. He slept under a window that watched the stars and woke most nights as if they had called him by rank and old habit, then reminded himself he could listen without leaving. Visitors came. Some brought children to meet the dragons who were now legends. Some brought small jars of soil from worlds he'd helped keep under light. A few brought questions. He liked those best. One afternoon, a girl stood in his doorway holding a napkin-wrapped object that smelled faintly of strawberries. She looked at him with the direct eyes of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of asking for big things. "Are you the man who learned to ride the sky?" Elias smiled. "Sometimes I was the man who remembered not to fall." Can anyone learn it? He considered the shape of the world and the number of edges it offered and the number of hands that had helped him not slip. "Not alone," he said, "but yes." She unwrapped the napkin. Inside was a little stone polished by many fingers. It looked like nothing, the way a seed looks like nothing if you don't know time. "Will you keep this? It's from the place my mother says you made safe." He took it and felt his throat constrict. He put the stone in the pouch with the fossil and the shells. "I'll keep it like a promise." His hair went white at the temples and then everywhere else. His knees clicked. Pip pretended not to notice and landed softer when she brought him rides. Ember argued with him about politics and then cooked for him in a way that involved a lot of smoke and made him cry and blame the pepper. Halo wrote a book about bridges that never mentioned him once and was wholly about him. Flint sat with him at dusk and made sure the prevailing winds didn't steal his warmth. He thought more often about how beginnings hide in endings and endings borrow from beginnings. The memory stick stayed in a drawer. He didn't need to watch it because the footage lived in his bones. Sometimes he dreamed he was walking a city that was all wings, and nothing hurt there because weight had learned how to be held. And then one evening the sky over Violia went wrong again. He felt it first as a change in hum, the kind of atmospheric shift you can convince yourself you imagined. Then a high, thin note threaded the air, the sound of metal under too much strain. He stepped outside and saw a tear in the sky like a paper cut, and through it something old and hungry. The rim eaters had found a cleverer door. He could have stayed. He had done enough, the universe would say, if it were the kind of universe that spoke. But he could feel the part of him that had stood in front of rifles bending him toward the landing pad, toward the old harness and the pouch and the prayer he didn't know he was praying. They were there before he could call Pip and Ember, Halo and Flint, standing in a row like doorposts. Their bodies were bigger than the canyon now, but they had learned to fit. Pip bumped his shoulder with her nose. Ember breathed out once and it smelled like strawberries. Halo bowed her head and there were tears in her eyes, which surprised him until he realized knowing a lot sometimes hurt more. Flint lowered himself to one knee and Elias climbed as if a staircase had unfolded. "I am an old fool," Elias said softly. "We are 4 old fools with you," Flint replied, and the joy in the thought left no room for fear to sit down. They launched together one last time, not to win but to show up. That had always been the private definition he used for heroism. Not the absence of fear, not even the persistence of hope, but the refusal to leave when leaving would be safer and easier and make a kind of sense that logic liked. They climbed into the torn sound of the sky. The enemy looked the way it always had, like a principle more than a creature, a physics lesson that had grown teeth. The fleet formed in a crescent that remembered old crescents. Mara's voice came over band, older, steadier. "Ward, I should have known." "I'll be home in time for your awful coffee," he said, lying as kindly as he could, and laughed when she swore back at him fondly. The fight was music, tattered music, but pitched in a key his heart remembered. He knew the phrases. He cut on the rests. He took hits and gave patience. Pip danced the impossible line between recklessness and art. Ember hammered where hammers were needed. Halo read the flow like a score. Flint did the things no one else would because they hurt too much or required a spine that had been burned and remade. The tear in the sky wobbled. The fleet pushed. The enemy didn't like losing its doorway and said so with fire. Elias felt heat inside his chest that wasn't fear and realized he had moved in front of something on purpose again. A flight of unarmed medical shuttles trapped between hooks and a hard place. He had done the calculus wrong, too old, too slow, or maybe the fight had finally asked for something he couldn't bargain down. He felt the hook bite into the harness across his back. He heard Flint scream. He smelled strawberries. He looked down and saw kids in windows with their hands on glass. One was the girl with the strawberry napkin stone, or someone like her from a world that still grew sweetness in rows. She wasn't crying. She was watching, solemn and furious at the idea that existence might be crueler than what she'd learned to expect. Elias opened his hand. The pouch with the fossil slid against his palm like a friend saying, "I'm still here." He put it to his heart and then pressed that hand to the iron of the hook and did something ridiculous. He let go, not of life, of fear, of needing to keep absolutely everything he loved in his fingers. He relaxed his shoulders and leaned into the hook the way he had once leaned into wind to find the current that would carry. It gave him a fraction of a degree. It was enough. The medical shuttles slid under the arc of his body into a lane ember, and Halo had burned clean. Flint hit the hook with his chest, just below the scar, and broke it with a sound that ripped into the concept of limits and rearranged a few of them. Elias felt himself falling and expected fear. He found peace sitting on a rock, legs swinging. He landed on Flint's back. Pip shrieked and did something that might have been a prayer in the language of speed. They carried him out of the kill box, and the fleet closed the doorway with a shove that resounded through 3 systems and left echoes in the bones of anyone who had believed something like that could even be tried. After, the world did what worlds do. It kept going. There were new crops to plant and old wounds to tend and parties to throw in cities whose streets had learned the pattern of steps of dragon feet walking gently. There were arguments about rebuilding budgets and where to place statues, and whispered jokes about how to design a bench so a dragon could sit with you if she wanted to, and not if she didn't. There was a quiet ceremony on a carrier deck where Mara put a small metal shape in Elias's hand and said, "I will never make that coffee again," and meant thank you for not dying today. Elias returned to the canyon once more with legs that resented stairs and a heart that made room. He built his last cairn. He put the fossil on top and the shells around it. He put the strawberry stone under the fossil where it would never be lost. He stood with his 4 and his eyes filled, and he did not apologize for any of it. "Did I do enough?" He asked nobody and everybody and the wind. "You tended the fire," the wind said in the voice of a giant who had become part of everything. "The rest learns from what your hands remembered." He slept that night under stars large as coins, with Pip's shoulder warm against one side and Flint's breath calm against the other. Ember pretended not to watch the door. Halo turned pages carefully. He dreamed he was walking across a bridge that arced from a nursery full of broken shells into a sky where loss and joy were the same size, and neither one needed to win. When morning came, he woke easily and without urgency for the first time in years. He sat in the doorway of the round house and watched light move down the canyon wall the way a mother runs her hand through a child's hair when she knows the day will be kind. He put on the kettle because that's what he did when he wanted to tell the world he meant to be here a bit longer. He smiled at the kettle's little complaints. A messenger boy appeared at the mouth of the canyon with a pack too big for his back and a grin too large for his face. "Sir, Captain Ward, Mr. He faltered in the presence of too many titles and too much legend. "Elias is fine," Elias said. "You want tea?" The boy nodded with the gravity of someone receiving a promotion. "They sent me to ask." He dug in his pack and produced a sheet of old-style paper with words stamped in blue. "To ask if you would speak at the opening of the new school in the lowlands, the one with the windows that face the wind." Halo snorted softly without looking up from her book. Elias tried to look stern and failed. "Tell them I'll come if they let me sit near a window." The boy brightened and then sobered. He looked at the dragons as if he were counting them. He lowered his voice to the volume you use for sacred questions. "How did you know, back then, that they could be like this?" Elias turned the question in his hands like a tool he didn't want to put down yet. He looked out at the canyon where the wind made the chimes sing a note that sounded like a home learning its name. He remembered a man crawling through dust toward a cleft in stone because there was nowhere else to go, and 4 small creatures whose eyes were still learning light. He remembered hunger meeting hunger and deciding to share. "I didn't know," he said. "I just didn't want to be the kind of person who killed a newborn because it was easier than hoping." The boy nodded as if that was a homework assignment he could do. He gulped tea, bowed to the dragons as if he'd been taught well, and ran back into the day. Elias watched him go and felt tired in the good way work leaves in muscles. He looked at his companions, their lights, their scars, the long road between, and decided the story of his life fit in a single breath if he let it. I stayed. When he finally left, years later, he did it the way the mother had, mid-sky, mid-laugh, mid-story. He died on a clear day with the earth far below and heat in his chest that wasn't pain. Pip carried him down, and Ember set a line of fire that spelled his name in a language no one had known before they held it together. Halo wrote and Flint stood. The cairn grew by the inch as hands added their stones. Young hands that hadn't met him, old hands that had. Human hands, dragon claws. The hands of those small species who had watched from the margins and then stepped into the light. Years remade into decades. Stories got details wrong and truths right. Children pretended to ride on stair banisters and shouted battle cries that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Dragons chaperoned field trips and pretended not to enjoy the attention. The wind kept talking. On the centennial of the Canyon Day, the school with the wind-facing windows sent a class to clean the cairns. They found the fossil and the shells and a strawberry stone under them, and the teacher told a story that made all the kids quiet and then bright. What did we learn? The teacher asked at the end, the ritual question everyone knew and still wanted to answer. A small boy with a too-big backpack raised his hand and spoke the old line that had grown into the ending of every telling, the line that had outlived war and would outlive the next, the line that felt like an oath and a map and a promise you could keep without hurting anyone else to do it. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.